The proceeding will start shortly.
4, 3, order. Welcome to this morning's session of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee for our latest hearing as part of our UK labour markets inquiry. This is the first of two sessions where we're looking at workers' rights and workers' protections within the labour market. We're delighted to welcome, as our first panel today in the room, Hannah Reid, who's the Coordinator for Constitutional Affairs at Unite the Union, and Jennifer Soul, who's the co-chair of the ELA Working Party at the Employment Lawyers Association. And on the screen, we have Alex Hall-Chan, who's the Advisor for Sustainability, Skills and Employment at the Institute of Directors. Good morning to all of you. My first question is that the government has said to us, in evidence to this inquiry, that, and I quote, the UK has one of the best employment rights records in the world. Is that right or not? Hannah Reid.
Thank you very much. Can I start by saying thank you very much for the invitation to give evidence this morning? And perhaps unsurprisingly, my response to that question is no. This answer is really backed up by all the international evidence. OECD analysis published back in 2019 showed that out of the world's most prosperous countries, only with the exception of the United States of America and also Canada, the UK has the weakest level of employment protection legislation compared to all those other countries. This is largely due to the fact in the UK that employees have to wait for at least 2 years to qualify for unfair dismissal rights and also for redundancy payments, but it also reflects the weakness of our collective redundancy laws. And we've all been too aware in recent years the weakness of those laws have led to employers being able to get away with tactics such as fire and rehire. Everyone's very familiar with the P&O scandal, but there are many other workplaces as well where Unite has fought and in some instances won to protect jobs and pay and conditions for workers where fire and rehire has been used. But to date, the government still has done nothing to protect workers experiencing such exploitative practices. The second area of weakness I'd like to flag is our law in the UK on employment status, which means that millions of working people in this country lose out on basic employment rights. That's unfair dismissal protection, family-friendly rights, and also trade union rights. That includes, of course, workers on zero-hours contracts, agency workers, and those in false self-employment. And may I just very briefly, Chair, also flag up the third area of concern for Unite, and this probably underpins all the wider concerns that we will talk about in this morning's sessions, and that is the very limited level of collective bargaining coverage that's experienced in the UK at the present time. Research from the OECD, IMF and the ILO, not necessarily trade union-friendly organisations, quite the opposite, they all confirm that collective bargaining is the most effective way of delivering sustained pay rises, the most effective way of tackling inequality in the workplaces, and also one of the most effective routes of producing increased productivity in workplaces. Workplaces where collective bargaining takes place, all the evidence shows there tends to be increased investment in skills, there tends to be lower staff turnover, there tends to be higher productivity. Yet in 2019, and I use that figure for comparison purposes, the UK only had 26.9% collective bargaining coverage. That compares to 50% or plus in Germany, 75% in the Netherlands, and over 90% in countries such as Sweden and Finland. We all are very aware that we're facing a major historic cost of living crisis in this country. Families are struggling to feed themselves, to pay their household bills. We believe in Unite that there would be no more important time for the government to introduce legislation to support collective bargaining, but instead, regrettably, we see a government introducing measures that are restricting the ability of working people to stand up for their rights at work, constraining their ability to exercise their fundamental right to strike. So no, we don't agree with the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer, that was a clear no in response to the government's view that we have the best employment rights record in the world. Do you have any understanding as to why they might think that?
I wouldn't comment on whether we've got good employment rights or not, because I can't answer any questions on policy, being an apolitical organisation. But I would flag that we do have concerns as employment lawyers about the retained EU law bill and the effect it's going to have, turning off many employment laws in this country on the 1st of January 2024. And also the effective enforcement of employment rights. The employment tribunals and the backlog are two causes of concern for our membership.
Okay, so work to do. And Alex Hall-Chan, from an employer's perspective at the IOD, do you think we've got the best employment rights record in the world?
So I don't think we'd be drawn on the international comparison element of that. I think on the UK, our perspective would be that the current employment rights framework achieves a reasonable balance between employee protection and employer needs. I think there are obviously areas where employee rights will need to evolve, particularly to reflect changing working practices such as flexible working, and we would welcome changes along those lines. We'd hope they'd be done on a case-by-case basis. And of course, if they were to increase the cost of compliance for employers, we'd want to work with government to reduce those costs. And I'd also echo concerns, which I'm sure we'll come to later, around the EU Retain Law Bill.
Okay, thank you. I've got a very quick supplementary from Alexander Stafford.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just very quick, something to you, Hannah, about comparing when you talked about us having basically no one having a right before 2 years in employment, and obviously we're talking about retained EU law. One of the things that I've experienced, I've picked friends and colleagues, is that yes, in the EU they have more rights when they start, but there's also a far bigger culture across the EU of internship after internship after internship, which basically acts as a probationary period anyway, and actually discriminates against people who can't afford to do serious internships. So in other words, a lot of companies in the EU have people on these rolling internships. It's regular to have a long-term internship, and then they get employed. So actually, it's the same thing, but actually have less rights in the EU. We just comment on that side of things.
So, may I, Chair, to respond? Thank you so much. Obviously, Unite and all trade unions are not in support of internships, particularly where we've seen in recent years a growing practice in the UK of individuals being expected to pay to actually take up internships. I'm less familiar with the actual comparisons in terms of use of internships in Europe. What I am aware, however, is that all the international data does show that the level of job security insecurity is far higher here in the UK than in other countries, and also the fact that in the UK we have lower collective bargaining agreements, which means that workers generally are less protected in the workplace, have less security.
Okay, thank you. Andy MacDonald, please.
Thank you, Chair. I kind of just come on to straight to the issue about reasonable balance, the balance between employers' rights and freedoms and those of workers. I mean, if we look, for example, at the P&O ferry debacle, where was the balance there, where any rights were traduced? And in fact, the company figured in the cost of the breach of the existing legislation. Was balance effective there? Can I put that to Alex, please?
I think it's clear in the P&O case that there wasn't balance there, and that P&O's approach to that was completely unconstructive. And as the IOD, for example, we're very supportive of the code that the government's going to introduce on fire and rehire tactics. So I would say, yeah, clear that there was no balance there, and that it's bad business practice and it's poor management.
We'll perhaps come on to that specific. But just to everybody more generally, do we need to see those employment rights strengthened? I kind of specifically ask whether you think there's credence to the notion of fair pay agreements being established in sectors so that everybody knows what the floor of terms and conditions are, allowing trade unions then to collectively bargain on top of that. Jennifer, I don't know whether you express a view on that.
I think, again, my viewpoint is from an employment lawyer perspective, so we have to balance claimants and the companies for whom they work. And certainty is key. So if you are going to produce a statutory guidance, then the workers know what their protections are, and also the employers can be certain as to what they are going to be within. Employers know what they have to do to comply with those guidance, and if it's statutory, then it's very clear to them. My colleagues worked with ACAS to produce their hire and refire guidance, and we'd be quite happy to also work with government if you were going to produce some statutory guidance and answer calls for evidence and consultations.
Hannah, to comment?
So certainly yes, we would I mean, everybody is in favour of flexibility in the workplace. The problem at the present time is that all the flexibility is on the employer's side and all the risk is taken by the employees. Unite believes certainly that employment law needs to be strengthened substantially. As I've mentioned already, for us the priority would be legislation introduced to promote collective bargaining, including legislation such as fair work agreements, and also legislation encouraging statutory rights for equality reps, for example, who negotiate on pay and conditions. And as I mentioned at the beginning, due to the weakness of our industrial relations system here in the UK, many working people are struggling on pay. The real rate of inflation at the present time is 14.2%. Many workers across the UK are experiencing serious cuts in living standards. Now, obviously, Unite is looking to negotiate wherever possible those pay awards, and we have achieved an increase in take-home pay for members of over £200 million in recent months. That's money that's being reinvested into local economies, not squirreled away. But obviously we are only present in those workplaces where we have secured collective agreements. While Unite is continuing in Ryanair, for example, to seek to win recognition, we need the government to step up to the plate more, to actually make collective bargaining more commonplace so that more workers can benefit from it. But it's not just simply legislation on collective bargaining that's needed. We've talked about the scandal at P&O, where we saw 800 members of staff laid off and replaced by agency workers, which led to a major issue in terms of security and operational safety and operational issues in that workplace. Again, Unite has been fighting across the country attempts by employers to again use fire and rehire tactics at Weetabix and elsewhere. But the government so far has failed completely to step up to the plate. They were very critical of the measures or of tactics that they witnessed in terms of fire and rehire, but to date we have seen no practice. I've mentioned also earlier on the continued growth in casualisation and in insecure working practices, with many workers having no guarantee over the number of hours that they work, how much pay they will take home, and yet we still have not yet seen the government's employment bill that might have introduced some very meagre proposals, but nevertheless proposals to try to increase the security of those members of staff in their working lives. We also believe at Unite there needs to be a reform of employment status. Happy to come back with more detail on that if that's helpful. It's welcome that the government recently ratified the ILO Convention 190 against violence at work. Yet again, we still haven't seen any commitments from this government about how that's going to be implemented in the UK. We would like them to start with ensuring that employers have a responsibility to get their staff home safely at the end of the day. But I would say at the end, and I know this is quite a considerable list, but it's a long time since we've seen any substantial improvements in employment rights in this country. We would say a good starting point for this government is to exempt employment rights completely from the EU retained law bill. That bill represents a major threat to UK workers' rights. There's need for action now to ensure that there won't be an erosion of workers' rights. Nobody voted in the referendum for worker employment rights, and we would also call on the government to drop its proposals to restrict further the right to strike.
Just finally from me, we've had commitments to the introduction of an employment bill from successive administrations over recent years. Do you think that is it's an important bill to try to pull all this together? Is there a commonality about trying to clarify the position? I don't know whether Jennifer would like to comment first on the
last mention of an employment bill was actually in the Queen's Speech in 2019, and since then there's been no change at all. There weren't that many potential changes to the law within that employment bill, within the Queen's Speech, as it were, and we were waiting, and we have been waiting for them to be elaborated on. We're aware that there's, Matthew Warman is currently looking back to the Good Work Plan, because we had the Taylor Review, the Good Work Plan, and there have been some legislative changes as a result of the Good Work Plan, but we are waiting for more. We wouldn't comment on what would be good and what would be bad, because we've got the apolitical stance, but we would be happy to explain any effect of the changes as they're brought to fruition.
But as an employment lawyer, I mean, presumably the lack of clarity that we see playing out in our courts on a day-to-day basis, where trade unions have to take matters to the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court to even establish the status of a worker. Surely clarity within a bill
is what everybody wants. Workers want to know their rights, employers want to know what they can and cannot do. And nobody wants to be caught within the system that is taking years currently, just at the basic level at an employment tribunal.
Alex, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I'd completely agree with that, that clarity is what employers want to see. A lot of comments that we'll have from members will be around uncertainty and the bureaucracy and stress that's associated with that. So we would absolutely welcome a bill that would clarify a lot of these issues for employers.
Hannah, is it a hat trick?
Very briefly, on employment status, we'd like to see the law changed so that there is a presumption that workers qualify for rights. That should be the working starting point, and it should be for employers to show that they're outside scope. But there were other measures in the bill that the government promised that we're still waiting to see and would welcome. That is laws to tackle unfair tips, to ensure that employers allocate all tips to the staff concerned. Also, there was a commitment from the government to extend redundancy protections to prevent pregnant or maternity discrimination, and those again are pressing issues. The last issue I'd mentioned very briefly, which has already been touched upon, is also the need for a very substantial investment in enforcement in this country. We've seen a 50% cutback in budgets for the HSE, for the EHRC in recent years. There needs to be a substantial investment in those resources for those agencies to ensure that vulnerable workers can have their rights enforced at work.
Thank you, Chair. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Mark Pawsey, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think if we listen to our witnesses, we would think the government's done nothing at all in this area. But of course, the government did publish some guidance on employment status, which happened in July of this year. Jennifer, how helpful was that?
I think, again, from the ELA perspective, we would welcome further explanation of the status
a step in the right direction, Jennifer.
So there are three tiers of status within UK employment law, but actually there's some 15 classifications that then fit under subheadings, and there's no specific tool that clients can use, whether they be workers who don't understand their rights or employers trying to establish that they're paying people correctly or giving them the correct contract, for instance.
So was what the government issued in July helpful and a step in the right direction, or was it no?
We would say that it would be helpful if you would go further.
But in itself, it was helpful.
Again, I can't say whether it's helpful for employment lawyers. I think the case law is more helpful than the guidance.
Okay, and Alex, what's your view of what the government produced in July?
I mean, we welcome the publication of the guidance. Would say it's a step in the right direction. Again, I think we'd want to see more clarity. It's a bit too early probably to tell sort of exactly what impact it's having for employers at least. But we would want to see more work in future to align particularly tax and employment status, which we know the government has recognised.
Okay, and Hannah, I'm suggesting you weren't entirely impressed by it.
Guidance can be helpful. I think the risk with this guidance, it didn't have any statutory status, so it can just simply be ignored in the courts. But our view would be that some legislation, we don't need major legislation, but some legislation would be helpful. As I've mentioned previously, we believe there should be a legal presumption, so the starting point should be that workers qualify for rights, and it should be for the employer to demonstrate that a person hasn't met that threshold for employment status. But if MPs are wanting to assist employers as well as obviously workers in terms of simplifying employment status, the easiest way to do with that is to reduce this three-tier approach that we have to employment rights in this country. All workers should surely be entitled to the same basic floor of rights.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Alan Brown, please.
Thanks, Chair. Jennifer, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the EU retained law bill. Can you maybe just clarify what concerns and what effect will this bill have on employment rights and obligations if it becomes law?
Mm-hmm. As drafted, there's a sunset clause which will turn off a huge swathe of employment rights, as I said, on 1st of January 2024. And that is because although that we have some primary legislation acts, there is an interwoven tapestry of rights which derive from directives, also from regulations in this country, which will cease to exist on the 31st of December 2023 as things stand. And that will have then a huge knock-on effect to us understanding our own precedents, which the case law, we are a common law jurisdiction, so that will then, 50 years is wiped away, and we've got an unknown slate again, and uncertainty is the big risk as far as we're concerned as advisors for both workers and for those people employing the workers who need to know what they have to do come the 1st of January 2024.
Is there any indication from the government in terms of what primary and secondary legislation would be required if the assumption was want to retain all these employment rights and laws?
So the regulations that disappear are, I have a list, working time regulations, so holiday pay, statutory maximum working week, parental leave regulations disappear, TUPE, outsourcing, so that workers won't have the right to transfer to their new employer if a contract's taken over. Part-time worker regulations and fixed-term working regulations will disappear, and so that will have a detrimental effect on a lot of women, because they tend to be most of the part-time workers, as been shown by case law. Health and safety regulations, so health and safety at work is under threat, and equal pay rights as well, because although we've got the Equal Pay Act, again, a lot of the clarification of that Act has come through our case law, which looked up to the European courts in order to answer some of our questions. And if that then doesn't exist on the 1st of January, we're back to not knowing what happened 50 years ago, and we've got potentially 50 years of litigation ahead of us, which is no good for anyone economically.
And you already said you want to see employment rights exempt from the bill. Was there anything you want to add? And I noted that it's not that long ago it was reported in the media that the government suddenly found 14 extra laws that they didn't even know about. So what does that say about competence in actual the programme to get this through?
I think that statistic is incredibly worrying, because what could happen on the 1st of January 2024 is we could lose rights that the government never intended to let slip away, but just disappear because they didn't happen to be aware of the list. The bill is incredibly worrying. We've already had a discussion of the sunset clauses. One point just to add in particular to the fact that law will just simply disappear overnight. It will be insecure, low-paid workers who particularly lose out from that, who are less likely to have clear contractual arrangements which provide enhancements in terms of occupational rights. Unite is also very worried that the government ministers will have very wide-ranging powers to revise laws, even if they stay on the statute book, without proper parliamentary scrutiny. But the major concern also, which often goes under the radar, is this suggestion that existing case law will simply disappear. That will not only cause chaos in the tribunals, but it will also mean a serious erosion in workers' rights. I have many good friends who are lawyers. I respect them, but I wouldn't really want to rely on lawyers to actually protect what are key rights of working people, to full holiday pay to take home so they can rest when they need to take a break, and to equal pay, for example. All of these rights are seriously under threat. So the government should completely exclude employment law from this area, including from the requirements for the loss of case law. Thank you.
Thanks. Can I just move on? Jennifer, so we're talking about people's rights, but obviously employment rights also depend on effective enforcement. So is there any issues in the UK at the moment in this respect of enforcement?
Yes, I alluded to this at the outset of today's session. We as a membership are extremely concerned with the backlog of cases within the employment tribunal system. As I said, we've got anecdotal evidence where listings are taking place 2 years after dismissals. The tribunal system now has far more cases to dispose of, to hear, than it did pre-pandemic. The pandemic has made it worse, but it was breaking anyway. And so we understand that the staff, the judges, are there, but there's not enough of them. So arguably it's resource, which I appreciate is not your area, but we need to get rid of the delay. There was one proposal, which actually I haven't seen in any of the recent literature from Bayes, but you were going to extend the time limit for employment tribunal claims for some of them from 3 months to 6 months. And that has disappeared off the agenda. I don't know whether that has changed as a matter of policy, but that was something that potentially could assist with the delays, because people wouldn't have just the 3 months to put their claim in, which is causing so many cases and such a big backlog.
In that the case of the time period was extended, that could allow more cases and create a bigger backlog?
Yes, on the other hand it could, but as advisors we would say that we've got greater scope to settle within a conciliation period pre-litigation, which is just causing chaos for the infrastructure of the tribunals.
And you mentioned resource being an issue, so what can the government do to resolve that?
They would. It's you need to sort out the delay. There needs to be some action. And you can talk about a single enforcement body later. Again, it wouldn't be ELA's stance to say that we advocate for or against a single enforcement body, but enforcement does need to be high on the agenda.
And do you want to add anything about enforcement?
I totally support everything that Jennifer has just said. Just a couple of additional points. We believe that government should take a more active role in terms of enforcement, not only resources, I would completely endorse that, but maybe there is a role for statutory enforcement bodies to enforce holiday pay, unpaid holiday pay, and also statutory sick pay. There were commitments made to that, but again, welcome action. And I think the critical point, Unite is not totally convinced by the proposals for the creation of a single enforcement agency. The risk is you pull together into one entity, different entities, you end up with a sum that is less than its parts. However, what is really needed is increased enforcement, increased investment in inspectorates. The risk of an employer ever being inspected by a state inspectorate is so low in this country, and hopefully one of the lessons we've learned from the COVID pandemic in particular is the need for substantial investments in the NHS to prevent, again, in the future, frontline workers either becoming seriously ill or losing their lives in such circumstances. Hopefully the investment in the HSE will be at the top of the government's agenda.
Thank you. Quick supplementary, Mark Jenkinson.
I just want to return to the retained EU law stuff, Chair, because I don't know if there's a misunderstanding of the bill or willful political misrepresentation, but there is absolutely no risk to employment law in the retained EU law bill. That would suggest that government would do nothing to, and ministers on record as wanting to protect employment law, that would suggest government would do nothing to retain thousands and thousands of statutory instruments and other instruments that have originated in European legislation. So where does this idea that everything will just disappear, that everything's at risk, come from?
The bill.
It doesn't come from the bill, Andy, at all.
It is the sunset clause within the bill. So my colleagues have prepared a really useful paper, we hope, that
There's a sunset clause in the bill, but there is also an expectation that departments will audit all retained EU law and either revoke or reform or assimilate. There is a clause in the bill to allow them just to assimilate into UK law. But all it is, literally, the retained EU law bill is just an audit exercise to ensure that we keep things we want and we don't keep things we don't. So where does the idea that, and there is of course an possibility of extension of that sunset clause by another 3 years to allow them to do that as well. So where does this idea that they're at risk come from? It is a political misrepresentation, is it not?
Yes. I wouldn't say so. I'd say that we're reading the bill and we are apolitical.
Obviously you're not reading the bill and you won't take, you tell us you won't take a political position, but that is a political position. If that is the LA's position, that is a political policy position.
I disagree. We've just said we have concerns that how the sunset clause will work, and we set those out within a paper, which I'm very happy to share with you. I didn't prepare the paper, but I have gone through today several regulations that would no longer exist on the basis of the bill as drafted. We would welcome the audit. We hope that we would be able to help with the audit by supplying this paper, which has set out the laws that will be affected and how they will be affected. That's our position, is within that paper.
Hannah, it is just a willful political misrepresentation that suits Unite's political purposes, is it not?
Well, two quick responses to that. I would disagree with that. If the government is committed to keeping on employment law, then the clearest way of doing that is to table an amendment to say that employment law is exempted from the scope of the bill.
I would disagree. I mean, we need to audit that legislation. Which is exactly what the Retained EU law bill does.
Can I just draw attention to one other element of the bill, which is not the sunset clauses, which is the deletion of years of case law. Trade unions such as United have worked for years through the courts to actually secure better rights for working people. That includes ensuring that workers get full holiday pay when they take leave. If you get bonuses as part of your pay previously under UK law, you wouldn't have been paid that during your leave break. You would have been paid overtime. The real concern is if that provision is left in the bill, then employment law would be weakened automatically. And that is the concern. Welcome if the government wants to say all employment law will be retained. We obviously would like to be consulted by the government on those proposals, but it is alongside the sunset clauses, the powers to reform, review and revise employment law, but also this loss of existing case law, which will have substantial impacts on working people's lives.
Is it not the case that UK case law remains and is not altered by that bill?
Okay, last points, please. Yeah.
Not necessarily, because they look to European case law in order to interpret, and that's where our jurisprudence will be affected.
UK case law is protected in the bill, is the answer there. So, thank you.
Okay, we'll need to move on, and we'll make sure that note gets circulated. Jane Hunt, please.
Thank you very much. And just to declare, I used to work for the Tribunal Service between 2002 and 2009 when there were backlogs as well, actually. Just moving on from Alan's question, what additional actions could be taken to ensure that employment tribunals are used as a last resort with equal opportunity for both parties to resolve the issue long before it gets to an employment tribunal, please? Shall I stop with Alex?
So I have to say this isn't an area that we've done a huge amount of work on, but if there are specific questions we could put to our membership, we'd be very happy to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Hannah, would you like to go next?
I might sound like a crack record, but there is one simple answer to this. One of the key roles that trade unions perform in the workplace every single day of the week, it doesn't get often the headlines and news stories, but it's actually resolving issues in the workplace using good workplace procedures that have been negotiated. That is the most effective way of actually avoiding the need for pressure on the employment tribunal. As a trade unionist, I would always say if we end up in an employment tribunal, that's a lose-lose for everybody. So we will always work wherever possible to resolve those disputes in the workplace, working with employers obviously in advance to try to prevent breaches of the law, but when they do arise to reach a settlement. Of course, Unite will represent members in tribunals where we can't succeed in the workplace, but that is the principal way of doing it, which again is why I guess there is some regret that in recent years we've seen more attacks on the role of trade unions when actually in workplaces we're doing our very best to work with employers to ensure that employment law standards are upheld and respected.
Thank you. Jennifer?
I'm afraid I think that's probably a policy decision that I'm not permitted to answer, but ELA will be really happy to work with you with any proposed consultations or legislations or guidance in order to give you our input as advisors.
I'll just ask a follow-up question to Jennifer. Do you think the ACAS process works within the employment tribunal process, and is there anything else you would do to that, do you think? Not policy-wise necessarily, just mechanics.
So actually I can refer to our survey results from last year, which was variable. So it actually depends on the conciliator, which is not a perfect answer, I appreciate. It's in principle, yes, it works, but it really does depend who you get on the other end of the phone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Andy MacDonald, please.
Thanks, Chair. Could I return to the fond issue of fire and rehire? And looking at P&O, when that happened...
Fire and rehire.
Sorry.
Well, it's a version thereof. People were sacked. That case brought it into the public discourse as a significant issue. And all hell was going to descend upon that company and any others who were engaged in fire and rehire the Centrica Clarks, British Gas, British Airways, amongst many others. We were told that the government would announce a new statutory code on fire and rehire. That was back in March 2022. We haven't seen that. That hasn't happened. And I'd just like to ask you, is a statutory code going to be a sufficient deterrent to employers who want to embark on such a course of action? Jennifer, do you want to?
As advisors, we'd welcome a statutory code, and we'd welcome the opportunity to work with you in producing it. Anecdotally, as our working party, we don't find this to be a very prevalent practice. I appreciate that I'm going to have colleagues that say different, and you have mentioned the British Airways, the British Gas and the P&O cases, which made it to the mainstream press and brought it to the attention of the man on the street. But there are reasons why companies need to fire and rehire, and the statutory code needs to separate those, explain what a good process is, and the good reasons for that process, so there's clarity. That's what we want as advisors, that's what our clients want, whether they be workers or whether they be the businesses that employ them, is the clarity, because uncertainty begets the litigation that we're all trying to avoid.
If there's no sanction, what's to stop people doing it?
That would be a policy decision for government, as to face the sanction.
Hannah?
I agree with most things that Jennifer says, absolutely. But just to say, I think there are still examples of fire and rehire happening. Obviously, P&O case brought it to the public's profile. But we recently, Unite has had to, or over the last year, has had to battle fire and rehire in BA, has been mentioned at Weetabix, and also more recently at Go North West. All of those disputes Unite has successfully won to retain jobs and to protect pay and conditions. But we know that too often, right across the country, employers are using this tactic of threatening people with their jobs, even in the midst of a cost of living crisis, in order to drive down pay and conditions, or they are threatening outsourcing as a means of driving down pay and conditions. Unite obviously would be very happy to work with the government, to be consulted by the government on a statutory code of practice. We, however, believe that there needs to be legislative reform to tackle this problem. And at the forefront of it should be a recognition that where employers are considering redundancies, they are properly consulting with trade unions and with the workforce. Too often employees will protest against these practices because they cannot see that the employer has any good reason. Often these employers are making substantial profits. They have no good reason to be laying staff off. That is what the purpose of collective redundancy consultation is, to enable trade unions and workforces to understand and to work with employers if restructuring is needed. But too often employers simply want to go ahead to cut headcount, to reduce the wages bill and to drive down pay and conditions. And that's the last thing we need to see in the midst of a record cost of living crisis.
So Alex, if we're stuck with a code of practice, what would have to be in it to make it effective and binding?
So firstly, I'd say that we are in favour of the new code. I think what we want to see from it in order for it to be effective is we want to see it solve confusion on the issue, provide clarity for employers. That's primarily what employers want.
Have you seen the code, Alex? Have you seen
the draft code?
Have you seen the code?
No, and we're
You're
hoping
in favour of it?
Well, we're in favour of the concept of there being a draft, being a code. And when it's published, which we hope will be in the near future, we'll of course engage with ID members, provide feedback on that. But the main thing for us is that we want to see clarity on what is and is not permitted under current law. Should ideally define good behaviour when it comes to practice, promote transparency, a partnership approach to restructuring, define ways in which its use may be legitimate.
And if the code is not observed?
I think we basically want to understand what current law permits before necessarily legislating to change it. But if there is strong evidence that it's not being observed, then of course government should look at additional measures.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Alexander Stafford, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. So we've obviously been increasing home working in the pandemic. Some unions have called for a statutory right to disconnect. What are your thoughts on it, and what do you want from actually a statutory right to disconnect? How will it work? Obviously, Hannah, you're nodding your head, so What do you want first? No to Jennifer. So how on earth is what this means?
Very briefly, I mean, the TUC supports, the Unite supports the TUC call for a right to disconnect. We all know, I mean, I, for example, have certainly experienced in my working life that our mobile phones become our remote control for life. And the UK already, workers in the UK already work some of the longest hours of any workers across Europe. So a right simply for individuals to be able to switch off from being online, from their mobile phone, so the employer knows that they need to contact them during certain times of the day. That is when those staff can be expected to be available. So the remainder of the time staff can spend with their families, resting, having fun. But we would also say, obviously, a right to disconnect simply helps those people who are working online by computer. We also would like to see a move in other sectors. It's being debated at the present time in manufacturing about shorter working weeks to avoid burnout, to avoid people dropping out of the labour market. We know we've had labour shortages at the present time. These measures may help people to have a better quality of working life and also a better work-life balance.
That all sounds very nice and all very, we all want that. But trying to get why we want a statutory right to that. My impression was every time I've had a contract, I've had my working hours between 9 to 6 or whatever at a certain location, and there's always an extra line in that contract saying usual working hours or except in special circumstances where you'll be required or whatever. There's always that get out. So if there is that sort of get out, which I presume there'll be in contracts, how would the statutory right to work actually work legally? Maybe Jennifer, how will this work?
I think you flagged a very real problem. It would be a huge challenge to find a way to legislate that's workable and practical. We've got the working time regulations which set the maximum working hours in a week. We've got health and safety legislation which requires risk assessments to be undertaken. The pandemic has led to this being a real issue, with the blurred lines between what's work, what's your office, home is the office. I think it would be a real challenge. We've seen other jurisdictions. You could look and learn from what they've tried to do. Some EU countries, we've got the Philippines and Argentina has brought in legislation. But the legislation isn't necessarily working in practice. So we think it would be a very difficult task. We would be glad to look at any legislation in consultation.
If it is a difficult task, do we need to have a statutory right for this? And does this take the onus away from the employers for making good workplaces and push it onto, frankly, unworkable law, which then will open a whole lot of legal challenges? So Hannah, you want to come back to that?
Just very brief. I mean, of course, you only need employment law because employers aren't always following good employment practice. I think the concern is that employers increasingly send emails at the end after normal working hours, and there's an expectation that people will respond. So in any law, it should be a basic understanding that an individual doesn't respond outside of their working hours, they can't suffer detriment. They can't be, not subject to not being promoted, not being disciplined, those type of activities. I think one of the other issues, which also is coming to the fore, is employers are increasingly using surveillance. Regrettably, when people are working at home, employers will be monitoring how many hours that individuals are on their Teams programme, how many hours they're actually typing on the machine, actually having cameras that can look into people's homes. Those might be some of the worst practices, but it would be helpful alongside a right for people to say, this is the end of my working day, I may be doing an extra half an hour, but I'm going to stop at that point and not to respond to any emails. Alongside that, having tougher rules on surveillance.
I know the chair wants me to be short, but I'm still trying to get into this. We already have the working time directive and not for hours. So I'm still struggling to understand how a law would make any difference to working people's hours any more than the working time directive, people working over that anyway. I'm trying to work out how this would work and whether we actually need it or just need to.
Very briefly, contract of employment places a duty on individuals to show goodwill and to cooperate with their employer. If an individual doesn't respond to a direct order or request from an employer, they could find themselves in difficulties or subject to discipline, or more likely not subject to promotion if they're not available at endless hours. The legislation would simply make clear, and should be obviously accompanied by guidance, to say an employer cannot, or if they send a message outside of the working hours, they cannot reasonably expect a response until the person is due back in the workplace. And if the individual fails to respond and suffers any detriment in the workplace, our laws are very familiar with detriment rules, then they should have compensation or action, further action should be taken.
So briefly, Alex, do you want to comment on any of this?
I'd just say, it's absolutely right, the government should look at this. There are some very valid questions about opportunities and challenges, including burnout of remote working. I think from our perspective, we feel that a legal right to disconnect would potentially be very prescriptive with regards to the nature of working environments. Needs differ, and we would probably think that arrangements are best determined at the company level by dialogue between employers and employees.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to all three of you for your contributions this morning. We're now moving quickly on to the second panel, and delighted to welcome